Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special lecture today. And today our speaker is Dr. Thomas Piketty. Now at first beginning, I would like to invite the Vice President of Academia Sinica, Dr. Fan Sheng Wang, to deliver the opening remarks. Now let's welcome Dr. Wang.
Professor Piketty, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We have so many distinguished guests here, so I won't name them. I'm honored to introduce Professor Thomas Piketty to you as today's keynote speakers. Dr. Piketty is a French economist and received his PhD degree at School of Advanced Studies in the Social Science in Paris, and the London School of Economics under the supervision of Professor Roger Gusneri. After receiving his PhD degree, he became an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at MIT. After moving back to Paris in 1995, he joined the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS. In the year 2006, Dr. Piketty became the first head of the Paris School of Economics that he assisted establishing. He is currently teaching at Paris School of Economics and EHESS. Just as his PhD thesis, which was looking at wealth redistribution, Professor Piketty focused his research on the dynamic of capital in the world and elaborate on the consequence of economic inequalities. He has numerous papers published in the top journals, such as QJE, Quarterly Journal of Economics, JPE, Journal of Political Economy, AER, American Economic Review, and Econometrica, and so on. He even published articles in a prominent history journal, and now, 年鉴学派, 年鉴. His best-selling books, Capital in the 21st Century, was published last year and has been translated into over 16 languages now. The book points out that inequality is not an accident, but a feature of capitalism, and it can only be reversed through interventionism. In the books, he suggests that inequality can be seized through a progressive wealth tax. Professor Piketty was rewarded with the prize for the best young economist in France in 2002. He also won the 2012, that award I don't know how to pronounce. And also, Professor Piketty, I just asked him and he didn't know how to pronounce. Award, which is granted to economists under the age of 45, having made a great contribution in theoretical and applied research that is significant to the study of economics in Europe. Nowadays, we all know that the trend toward higher inequality is a global issue. It is not only happening in Europe and the US, but also in Taiwan. Today, Professor Piketty is going to talk about capital in the 21st century and share his view with us. So let us welcome Professor Piketty.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm very, this is my very first time in Taiwan, and I'm very honored to be here to present my work. We just had a very interesting and productive meeting with Cyrus Chu and his team, who are now extending some of the historical data collection work that we've been doing for a number of countries to Taiwan. And I just saw the data this morning, so I could not include it in my book or in my presentation. But I'm very happy that more historical work on income and wealth inequality is being done in Taiwan, and the general objective of this project is certainly to try to extend the study of inequality to as many countries as possible, and of course the case of Taiwan is very particular and very interesting. I should get this to move with the slides. So in this presentation, I'm going to present a number of results coming from my book, Capital in the 21st Century. Let me first. So this presentation is going to be based on this book that was. So the book was published first in France in September 2013. So this was first written in French. I mean, as you can hear, my use of foreign language is far from being perfect, and my written French is much better than my written English. So I wrote the book in French, and I had a wonderful translator to translate it in English. And that was published in English last March 2014. And this was just published in Taiwan, I guess, this week. And I heard the translation in Taiwan is very good, but I am not able to say. But several people told me it was a very, very good translation. So I'm very happy that my book is now available in Taiwan. So in this book, I study the global dynamics of income and wealth distribution in over 20 countries, sometimes even over 30 countries for some parts of the data set since the 18th century in some cases. And I really try to put historical data that has been collected over the past 15 years with a very large number of researchers from many countries. So let me make clear that this book could not have been written without this large group, this large team to collect historical data. So the issue, what's really new in this book is this historical and sort of systematic approach to the problem of income and wealth distribution. So the issue of income and wealth distribution, of course, has been has played a large role in the history of economic thinking and historical research for a long time. But for a long time, in the 19th century, economists that were interested in income distribution, like Malthus, Ricardo, or Marx, had very little data at their disposal. So their work was mostly theoretical. Of course, they were inspired by what they thought they saw around them, and Marx was very influenced by what he viewed as a stagnation of wages and booming profits. And to some extent, this is what was happening indeed in the 19th century in Britain or France. So they were influenced by what they perceived of the situation around them, but they had very little systematic source of data, which limits what you can do. And some of these works, when you read them today, to me are very sort of theoretical and speculative and sometimes a bit too abstract, but to me at least. Now in the 20th century, more data intensive and historical approach started to develop. In particular, the work by Kuznets in the 1950s was the first systematic attempt to measure income distribution. So Simon Kuznets was a American economist, born in Ukraine, but then moved to the US around 1920, and was the first economist to compute national accounts for the United States, GDP statistics for the interwar period. And then his next task in the 1950s was to compute the first series on income distribution. So he combined the national accounts that he had just computed, the first series of national income, with income tax data, which appeared in the US with the creation of the income tax in 1913. So he used the income tax data from 1913 to 1948. And he published a very influential book in the 1950s showing a very sharp reduction of income inequality in the US between 1913 and 1948, with a big decline of the share of national income going to the top 10% from about half of national income to about 1/3 of national income. And I'm going to show you this result in a minute. And all what we've done in this project, to begin with, was really to extend the work of Kuznets to many more years and many more countries. Okay, so Kuznets had basically one country for 35 years, the US between 1913 and 1948, and we have over 20 countries and now close to 30 countries over an entire century. So this is the first part of the database that we use in the book, is really this extension of Kuznets to more countries, more years, looking at top income shares, which, as we are going to see in a minute, changes quite a bit the perspective. So Kuznets had this very optimistic conclusion of reduction of inequality in the 1950s, 1960s, which gave rise to the very optimistic theory of the Kuznets curve, with the idea that in advanced stages of economic development you have a reduction in inequality. And this was very powerful message also in the Cold War context. This was a way to tell, in particular, the developing world, developing countries, that in a way they just need to wait. At some point, the growth process will also generate a reduction in inequality, and they should not become communists. They should not do bad things. They should just wait. So Kuznets himself was really a scholar and was very well aware that the reduction of inequality that happened in the US was not so much a natural process and had a lot to do with the Great Depression, World War II, the wage compression policy during World War II in the US, the rise of progressive taxation in the US. So he was aware that this was not really a natural process. But in the context of the 50s, 60s, 70s, people wanted to believe in happy end, and at least in the West, they wanted to believe that inequality and capitalism, could move in the right direction. And I think that's part of the reason why people were so optimistic. Now with the data we have today, of course capitalism produces lots of growth and improvement in average living standards, and that's very important. But in terms of distribution and inequality, I don't think there's any strong reason to believe that there's a natural process toward declining inequality. There are powerful forces that can go in both directions. Sometimes inequality declines, sometimes it goes up, and we need to better understand, what are these forces and what we can do about them. And so the overall objective of this project is to do this, and the overall objective of this book is to make all this data accessible. I think this is a very accessible book. It's not a technical economics book. This can be read by anyone. There's a little bit of economic theory and theoretical model in the book, but these are very simple models. I think when economists use complicated mathematical models, usually this is not a good sign, because I think most of the important economic facts that we are able to explain can be explained with simple models. So a little bit of math is useful, but too much, at least in economics, in astrophysics or quantum mechanics, or it's certainly different. But in economics, I think we should be very modest. We know very little, and we should start from simple facts and see what kind of simple theory can explain them, and that's what I try to do in this book. So the book is putting together two different data sets, one on income distribution, which I have just described, and some other data on wealth, and which in a way plays an even more important role in the book, because the book is trying to shift the attention from income inequality to wealth inequality. So the measurement of wealth distribution, is in a way more complicated than income distribution, because in most countries we don't have annual wealth tax. We have inheritance tax. We have some form of property taxation, but usually they are not comprehensive. So the data sources on wealth are in a way less systematic than for income. On the other hand, the data sources on wealth are very often older than those for income. So you have registration of wealth starting in the 18th or 19th century, or even before that, because the registration of property plays a very important role in every society in order to transmit property rights across generations. So you can find in the inheritance archives a very old source of data on wealth that you would not find for income. So, wealth allows you also to look at a longer perspective, and if you want to go back to the 18th or 19th century, you cannot really do it for income, but you can do it for wealth. Let me show you a little bit more what kind of data we have. So regarding income, most of the data in the book comes from this World Top Income database. So the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are about to enter. In fact, this map is not up to date because Taiwan, will soon enter the database thanks to the work of Cyrus Chu and a group of researchers in Taiwan. Korea also just entered the database. One good thing with the book and the publication and the success of the book is that more countries now are entering the database, sometimes because governments allow access to their fiscal data, which they did not allow before, like in Brazil or Mexico. We are also going to have access to the data. So what it means to put a country in the database is that we try to collect all the historical data on income that we can find. So usually the oldest source of data on income goes back to the income tax. So it's important to have in mind that income taxation is also a way to, it's always, taxation is always more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information about society. This is true for income, this is true for wealth. The registration of wealth is an important part also of to try to guarantee property rights, and that's important for the organization of economic activity. So taxation produces legal categories, statistical categories, which then can be used to study the distribution of income and wealth in society. So let me show you what we find. So this is for the United States. So the decline in income inequality is exactly what Kuznets found. So Kuznets in the 1950s was the first to compute this series, and all what we've done is to extend it to until today. So this is a very simple indicator of income inequality. This is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So as you see, these vary between, say, 1/3 to 1/2 of total income going to the top 10%. And you have this huge decline in inequality during the 1930s and during World War II. Then you have a stabilization in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then you have a very large increase starting around 1980. So in the 50s, 60s, when Kuznets was writing, indeed there was this relatively optimistic view of a reduction of inequality, and then the stabilization of the share going to the top 10% in this period means that this is really the post-war period of sort of balanced growth path, in the sense that when you have a stable share going to the top, it means that everybody benefits from growth exactly in the same proportion. If you have a GDP growth rate of 3% in 1950 or 1960 in America, well, everybody grows at 3%. The average income of the top 10 grows at 3%. The average income of the bottom 90 grows at 3%. So, you have rich people, you have poor people, but they all move up in the same proportion. Okay? So growth is really all what matters. You just want to have good growth, and so that everybody goes up. Now, in the recent period, the problem is that some people go up a lot more than others, and in proportions that are really quite spectacular. When you go from 1/3 to 1/2 of total income going to the top 10% in just 30 years, it means that a very big part of the growth is in effect being absorbed by the top groups. So, if the growth performance of the US economy had been, 10% per year like China, or, 5%, maybe it is not so bad to have 2/3 going to the top. Maybe it's worth it. But, if you have a growth performance of only 1.5, 1.6% per year, if you look at per capita GDP growth in the US over this period, and if you have 2/3 of it going to the top, then it's not a very good deal for the rest of the population, because the rest of the population is almost stagnating. And indeed, the average income of the bottom 90%, had almost no growth over this period in the US, and many people now agree that this contributed to the rise of household debt in the US in 1990s, 2000, and that this probably contributed also to the fragility of the financial system. And so you can see, one of the very high point is 2007, and the previous high point was 1928. And so, many people looking at this graph thought, okay, maybe, rising inequality contributes to rising household debt, and maybe it's not so good for financial stability, and that's one of the reasons why people are concerned with inequality. Certainly not the only one, but that's one of the reasons. On this graph, I stop in 2010, but in fact, if you look at if you go online to the World Top Income Database, you will find the series until 2012-13, and you will see that it's for the latest year we have for 2012, and we will soon put online the data for 2013. It's even above the 50% line. It's between 51 and 52%. So the trend seems to be continuing, and you have this big cycle at the end that, of course, are due to the stock market cycle. So in 2001, 2002, you have a stock market crash. In 2008, 9 also. So this is, when you have a stock market crash, this is not a good time to have capital gains and stock options and large bonuses. But then after the crash, when you have the recovery, the trend seems to be continuing. So the cycle in itself doesn't seem to affect the trend very much, and so given the magnitude of the evolution, there's a question of how far this will go. So if you compare to other countries, I'm not going to show you every country because I want to spend most of the talk talking about wealth rather than income, but if you look in Europe or Japan, the rise in the top 10% share has been much less spectacular. You have an increase, but you sort of stay in around 35, 38%. So you start from the same level, but you don't go quite as high. There are countries like Britain that are sort of intermediate between continental Europe, Japan, and the US, and the series for Taiwan seem to be also intermediate between Europe, Japan, and the US, maybe closer to Britain or Singapore. But it's so there's been a significant rise in top income shares in a country like Taiwan, but probably not as spectacular as in the US, but probably more than Europe, Japan. But this is something that needs to be further studied. So the explanation for this rise in income inequality are, there are many explanations that played certainly an important role. Globalization and changing patterns of supply and demand for skills is probably important. Although, globalization also happened in Europe and Japan, and so, it's not enough just to say globalization to explain everything. You need to explain why in the United States maybe you have particularly unequal access to skills and education. So maybe the top groups have access to very good universities, but maybe the bottom 50% of the population does not have access to high schools or colleges which are so good. So you need something, particularly unequal access to skills to explain why the supply and demand for skills has generated higher rise of inequality in the US than in other countries. Labor market institutions also matter, the evolution of the minimum wages, the evolution of the role of unions. The evolution of progressive taxation probably also matters, probably the incentives for top managers in the US to try to raise their pay as much as possible, and sometimes, well beyond what can be justified by performance or productivity. Probably these incentives have increased particularly strongly in the US due to the very sharp decline in income tax progressivity over this period. So the US used to be one of the countries with the highest level of income tax progressivity, as I will show you later, and after Reagan has become one of the countries with the lowest level of income tax progressivity, and probably this has contributed to changing the incentive for among top managers to try to get very large pay increase and stock options. So there's a variety of institutional factors, from educational institution, labor market institution, corporate governance, taxation, that can account for this. And generally speaking, what I try to emphasize in in the book is that there's really a multitude of institutions and policies that determine the long-run evolution of inequality. So, I don't believe in deterministic economic forces. I think all these policies and institutions matter. In particular, I should say that sometimes people summarize my book talking about R versus G, the rate of return and the growth rate. This evolution, I think, has nothing to do with R versus G. R versus G is probably important. I will talk more about this later for the very long-run evolution of wealth inequality. But for the inequality of labor income, this is not what matters. What matters is inequality in education, supply and demand of skills, labor market institution. So, it's important when we look at inequality to distinguish between these different dimensions of inequality. You have inequality in labor income, inequality in capital ownership, so correlation between the two. The ratio between total wealth and total income, and which I'm going to look at right now. And all these dimensions are determined by different processes, different mechanisms, and we should not try to put everything in the same box as just inequality. Okay, so let me move now to the study of the ratio of wealth to income. And so this is another U-shaped evolution which I study in the book. So, it looks a bit like this one, you have a decline and then a rise, but in fact it's very different. It's a very different economic process. So this is not really about inequality, this is about the capital income ratio. So this is the ratio, so more precisely what you have on this graph is the ratio between aggregate private net wealth and national income. So aggregate private net wealth, this is the value of all assets owned by private household. So this includes real estate, business assets, financial assets, minus all their debt, all their financial liabilities, divided by national income. National income is like GDP, except that you need to take away capital depreciation and put back net foreign income. So that's typically 90% of GDP. So the ratio will be the same if you divide by GDP, but national income is a more meaningful concept because if you destroy the entire capital stock of a country through some natural disaster, and the entire country is busy rebuilding the capital stock, you can have a very large GDP, but of course national income can be very small because this is just, so when you take away capital depreciation, maybe the real new value produced is very small. So national income is a more meaningful concept than GDP in general, so that's why I prefer to divide by national income than GDP. Anyway, you have a very high ratio of capital to income until World War I in Europe. Then this declines very strongly during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. That's because of a mixture of factors, the capital destruction, of course, in France and Germany. But even more importantly, you have very little investment during this period. Most of private savings is used to finance the war, to finance public debt. And so this is paying for the war, and the war itself is paying for the destruction of the capital stock. So that's a very sad story, but this is the story of Europe during this period and other parts of the world as well. So in 1950, you have a very low level of private wealth to income. That's also partly due to new policies to regulate private capital after this period. So you have nationalization in some countries in 1945, so there's less private wealth, but you have more government wealth, as I will show you in a minute. You have also rent control policies that are quite strong in 1950, 1960, so this reduces the market value of real estate. So this is not necessarily a decline in the volume of capital, but also a decline in the price of capital. And I make the decomposition in the book, and in France or Germany, maybe there's 1/3 destruction, 1/3 lack of investment, and 1/3 due to policy-induced changes like nationalization and rent control. And the exact decomposition can be different in other countries. Anyway, starting around 1950, you have a process of recovery. And today, the capital income ratio, still seems to be going up, and it's comparable, although probably still a bit lower than what it was prior to World War I. Now, let me make clear that this is not a graph about inequality per se. The fact that we have more capital relative to income in a country is certainly not bad in itself. This is good to have more capital, rather than just to have debt. And we talk a lot about public debt in Europe these days, but it's important to realize that private wealth relative to GDP has increased a lot more than public debt relative to GDP. So it's good to have more capital for society as a whole. The problem is the inequality of capital concentration, but the objective is not to reduce the capital income ratio. Maybe you want to make it more equal, you want to have more mobility in capital ownership, but there's you certainly don't want to return to 1950 where everything has been destroyed. That's not an objective in itself. So sometimes I think people make a wrong interpretation when they look at that kind of evolution and they say, well, it's bad, there's more and more capital income ratio, but in itself there's nothing bad in this evolution. There's something natural. It's another lesson from this graph is that capital accumulation takes time, and it's important to have an historical perspective on these issues. The World War shocks were enormous shocks, and it took a very long time to recover from them. Maybe the simple equation, I say simple math can be useful, so maybe the simple equation that one should have in mind is that if you save 10% of your national income each year, or sometimes 20% of your national income each year, it will take 50 years to accumulate 5 years of national income in capital. And in fact, it takes even more than that because your income denominator is growing at the same time, but maybe you invest more than 10%. But you can do the simple math, and I do them in a more detailed manner in the book and in the research papers on which the book is based. But capital accumulation is a process that spans over several generations, and in order to understand where we are going in the 21st century, it's important to take this long-run historical perspective on income and wealth. And if we only look at the past 10 years, we don't really understand what's going on. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on this, probably mostly on the first two issues, the return of what I call patrimonial society, particularly in Europe and Japan, where wealth-income ratio seem to be returning to very high levels. So that's particularly true in Europe and Japan as compared to the US, because in Europe and Japan you have much lower population growth than in the US, and the basic intuition is that in a slow growth society, wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important. So, part of the reason for the particularly large increase in wealth income ratio in Europe and Japan in recent decades, in addition to this recovery process, is the aging of population. And in the very long run, this can be relevant for the entire world to the extent that there will be a population stabilization or even population decline in a number of countries. Now, the second issue is really about inequality of wealth, and this is where the gap between R and G can be relevant in the long run. So I will argue that one important determinant of the level of wealth inequality of the long run is the ratio, the gap, the differential between the net of tax rate of return to capital and the growth rate. And let me be very clear about that, because sometimes people are surprised when we say that R can be bigger than G forever. So in fact, this is really not surprising at all. This is what we have in every theoretical model, and this is what we have throughout human history. Just to understand this, maybe the easiest way is to go back through time. During most of human history, growth was zero. So, of course, R was bigger than G because growth was close to zero, and the rate of return to capital was not zero. The rate of return to capital in traditional agrarian societies was typically 5%. The return to land rent was typically 5% of the value of the land, or sometimes people were putting it the other way, which was the value of the land was 20 years of annual income of the land. And every reader of 18th century literature or 19th century literature, Jane Austen in Britain, or any literature of this period, knows this very well. In the same paragraph, the novelist will go from the 1,000 pound annual income to the 20,000 pound capital value, and this was obvious to everyone because this was in a way the foundation of society. This is what allowed a group of owners to live off their wealth and to do something else in life than to care about their own survival. And so this was very important. This is how society was organized, and this did not imply rising inequality forever. This just implied a perpetuation of inequality of wealth at a very high level. But inequality was not rising. R bigger than G does not imply that inequality rises because the wealth owners, of course, were consuming the return to the wealth. This is what allowed to have a high living standards. Now, this was the traditional patrimonial society until the Industrial Revolution. Now, some people believe that the Industrial Revolution in itself has changed everything, and some people also believe that today, new growth has changed everything. I think it has changed a number of things, but it has not changed everything. And in fact, one of the findings of my book is that modern industrial growth did not change this basic relation between R and G in the long run as much as one might have expected. So, of course, the growth rate in the 19th century increased due to the Industrial Revolution, but it went from maybe 0% to 1.5%, 2% at most in the 19th century until World War I in Europe. And at the same time, the rate of return to capital also increased, maybe from 5 to 6, 7% with new forms of industrial investment. The long-run return on the stock market is typically 7%, 6, 7%. So the gap between R and G was not really affected by the Industrial Revolution. And I think this is one of the central reasons why the level of wealth concentration in 1914 Europe is not very different from that of Ancien Régime in 1789. And this is something that people had a hard time understanding in 1914. In particular, in my country, in France, the Republican elite thought that, okay, we have done the French Revolution, that's enough. We don't have a landed aristocracy anymore, so we are a country of equals. We have redistributed the land 1 century ago. Well, in fact, there was very little land redistribution. But anyway, this was the discourse. We have redistributed the land. That's enough. Except that in 1914, land does not matter anymore. What matters is the new real estate, business assets, foreign investment. This is a very dynamic economy. You have the invention of the automobile in 1900, the invention of electricity, transatlantic radio. This is at least as important as Facebook today. These are important innovations. And still, the growth rate was, 1.5% per year, which is already a lot as compared to pre-industrial societies, because this means that over a generation, over a 30-year period, you have between 1/3 and 1/2 of the economy that is being renewed. You have to, it's not easy to find a job, to have the right education in such a society, and this is a rapidly changing world. And in the 20th century, it is only, because of very unusual circumstances that we had a completely different balance between R and G. First, R was reduced by huge capital shocks, capital destruction, inflation, taxation. And then the growth performance of the post-war period was very high, 4-5% per year in Europe and Japan, to a large extent because of reconstruction and catching up after the war. And for emerging countries in recent decades, in China today, or the very high growth performance that we've seen in countries like Taiwan and Korea, this doesn't seem to be possible in the very long run. When you catch up with other countries, you can grow at 5%, 10% per year. But this probably will not continue forever. As you catch up with the world technological frontier, historical evidence suggests that the very long-run growth rate for productivity are closer to 1 to 2% per year, not 5% per year. And Taiwan, I understand, is already down to 3% or 4%, and probably at some point in the future it will get closer to what we have in Europe and Japan. In the very long run, of course, this will take time. So I'm not saying R bigger than G is certainly not the main problem in China right now. But in the long run, as growth rate go to 1 to 2% level, we might return to that kind of equilibrium. Also, competition to attract investment can be a powerful force that can reduce capital tax and more generally increase the bargaining power of capital in the world economy, which can also contribute to push the net of tax rate of return upwards. This is only a possibility. There are other forces that are playing a role, but if you look in the very long run, I think this can be an important force for the wealth inequality. So let me show you a number of additional results. I understand I should tell me at what time I should stop talking, so that I can adapt. No, don't. I don't think you want to say that. Yes. 30 minutes, yeah, okay, very good. So let me first, say, okay, I'm always going in the wrong direction with this thing. Okay, let me just say a few words about China. I just come back from a trip to China, so I thought I will try to say a few things about inequality in China. The short message is that it's very difficult to compare the inequality levels in China with Europe or US or Japan. In Taiwan now we have some estimates on top income shares because we have income tax statistics. The problem in China is that this is one of the only countries in the world where you have an income tax but you don't have any income tax statistics. So you don't know how the number of taxpayers by income brackets is changing every year. You have no information, and to me, I think this will be a way. More transparency on income and wealth in China will be very necessary. Including, I think to fight corruption or the grey economy. It's not enough just to put in jail a few people. I think it can be useful to have a more systematic approach to transparency and publishing the how many taxpayers by income brackets at the local level, I think will be a very powerful way not only to measure income distributions for people like me, but also for everybody in the country, to see whether the income tax is being properly applied or not. And I think in many cases you would see that you really don't have as many people in income brackets as there should be, or in any case, it's very difficult, to regulate inequality and a tax system if you don't publish any information about it. So, top income shares in China, we do give estimates in the World Top Income Database, but they are based on household survey because we don't have the income tax statistics. And the household survey, we know that they underestimate top incomes a lot. So there is a lot of evidence that inequality is rising in China, but the exact level of inequality and the exact magnitude of the increase in inequality is difficult to compare to other countries. Regarding wealth to income ratio, there is evidence that there is an increase in China as well, and there is some attempt to compute national balance sheet of China in order to compute the stock of private capital, the stock of public capital. These estimates indicate that the share of public capital, of course, is much bigger in China than in Europe or US or Japan, where the share of public capital, in the most developed countries is close to 0% or even negative, as I will show you in a minute, whereas in China it's close to 30-40%. Wealth inequality, again, there is evidence that China might have moved to a sort of a more European level, to a more American level of wealth inequality. But we don't really know, and I think production of income tax statistics and also the creation of a system of property tax and inheritance tax. So in Taiwan there is a property tax on real estate property, although at a very low rate as far as I understand. But there is a tax, there is registration of property, and you have an inheritance tax, of course. And I know there has been a lot of debate recently on reducing the inheritance tax and maybe increasing it again in the future. But at least there has been a tax on inheritance for a long time. In China, you don't have any tax on inheritance. This is 0%, which is really quite small. And it is strange that it is somehow the communist country that is competing with the capitalist country by having 0% tax on inheritance when the capitalist countries are trying to preserve some level of taxation on inheritance. So this is a very strange equilibrium. And in Hong Kong, there used to be a tax on inheritance, but it was repealed in 2005, I guess. So anyway, that's part of the complex equilibrium and capital and taxation in this part of the world, which you know better than me. but you know that I think everybody, not only China, will benefit from having China moving more in the direction of transparency on income and wealth. Now, let me return to the explanation for the rise in the capital to income ratio. So now, you know, I am going to zoom on the recent period. Well, by recent, I mean 1970 to 2010. So, you know, in the on this graph, this was a very long run, 1870 2010. So now I am going to zoom on the 1970 2010 period, so on the more recent decades. And here I was showing you decennial averages, so everything seems very smooth when you compute decennial averages. Well, not so smooth in the war period, but at least in the post-war period, you know, everything seems to be going up in a very smooth manner. When you look at annual series, you know, the history of capital is never so smooth. So, you know, you have lots. So this is, so I zoom on the 1970-2010 period and I show more countries. So here you have the top 8 developed economies in the world, US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Canada, Australia. And you can see that, you know, you have a general rise in the wealth to income ratio, you know, from 200 to 350% to 400 to 700%. So, you know, sometime in economic textbook, you know, people say that these ratios are constant, you know, but you should be very careful with textbook. You know, sometime in economics, when we don't know much about something, we just assume it's a constant, but it's in fact, you know, clearly it's not. It doesn't look like a constant to me. And you know, and when you look at the very long run picture, you could see that this was not a constant at all. And in fact, there's no reason why it should be a constant. You know, there's no theoretical model in economics that tells you it should be a constant. You know, the standard model of economic growth with capital labor substitution tells you that any ratio of capital to output can be an equilibrium. It all depends on how much you save and invest and how fast you grow in terms of population growth, productivity growth. And in particular, one of the key reasons for this general increase is the slowdown of growth. If you have lower population growth and also to some extent lower productivity growth, and you keep saving and investing, then you accumulate higher ratio of capital to income. Now, another factor that explains this evolution is the rise in real estate price. So the rise in real estate price, of course, is an issue that is also very important in Taiwan, but not only in Taiwan. This plays a very important role in this evolution in other countries as well. So you can see Japan between 1985 and 1990, where you have this huge increase in the wealth to income ratio. You know, in just 4 years, they increased their private wealth by 2 years of national income. You know, from 500 to 700%. Now, this cannot be just because of saving. You know, even with a Japanese saving rate, you cannot increase your wealth by 2 years of national income in 4 years. You will need a 50% saving rate, and nobody saves 50%. You know, even China now has an investment rate of 45%, but that's growth of capital depreciation. If you take away capital depreciation, it's more 30%, certainly not 50. So if you know, in order to get rich so fast, it must be because of a real estate price bubble or stock market price bubble or a combination of the two. And then, you know, in the 1990s, this declines. Now, in the long run, you can see that it's more than just a bubble, because this happens everywhere. So there must be some more structural reason for the increase. One is the slowdown of growth. The other one is that you can also have a long run increase in the relative price of real estate. This can come from several reasons. You know, one could be that, and I think this is, you know, very relevant for many countries in Europe and Asia. One could be that as you have higher accumulation of wealth, you know, you have to put your wealth somewhere. So, of course, you could all invest it in abroad, say in China or somewhere else. But, you know, maybe you feel more confident, you know, to put it in real estate in Taipei or in Paris or in Tokyo or in New York. And so this is going to feed the real estate price bubble. And another structural reason could be the different speed of technical progress in different sectors. So, you know, if you have less technical progress in the construction industry or in the transportation sector than in other sectors like information technology, computer, biotechnology, then in the long run, the relative price of real estate will rise, especially in the large capital cities where most of the economic activity of the high yield productive activity take place. So you can, in economic models, once you move away from the simple one good model of capital accumulation to a multi-sector model, anything can happen. The different speed of technical progress between different goods and assets can generate any change in the relative price you want in the long run. So theory in itself does not really put any constraint on what you can observe, and the general rise in real estate prices, could reflect a structural change in the pattern of technical progress. If you think of transportation technology, there's been some progress, but the speed of airplane, was not very different 40 years ago than what it is today. So it's not as compared to the technical progress in information technology or biotech. There's been much less. So that can increase local sort of rent effect due to the fact that everybody wants to live in the same capital cities. Anyway, there's another factor that is important in this evolution, which is, sorry, I got it wrong again, which is the decline in public capital. Okay, so this is, here I am, so you have the evolution of private capital, from 200, 300% to 400, 700%. But at the same time, during this period, you have a decline in public capital, which in some countries has become negative. So in Italy, in Italy, you can see that it's negative in 2010. So what negative means is that you have more public debt than public assets. So it means that, even if the Italian government was to sell all their public buildings, all their schools, all their hospitals, all their financial assets, that will not be enough to repay the public debt, and they will still have a negative level of public debt. So, I'm not saying they should do that. Many people will be shocked, if we were to sell all the schools, hospitals, and we had to pay rent to the owners of the primary schools to which we are sending our children. But so I'm not saying we should do that, but I think it's important to realize that in a way that's already what we are doing. So when we are paying large interest payment on our public debt, and the total level of our public debt is higher than the public assets, in effect, we are not paying rent to the owners of the primary school, but we are paying interest to the owners of the public debt, and it can be the same. So in a country like Italy right now, the interest payment on public debt are like 6% of GDP, and the total budget of their university system is about 1% of GDP. So in effect, you're putting a lot more money. So I'm not saying that the share of public capital should be, half of total capital or 30-40% like in China, but I think 0% is really small and negative is really small. When you have more public debts than public assets, this makes it difficult for government to fulfill their role, at least in the sectors where you need in education, in health, public infrastructure. You need public assets, and if you just have more debt than assets, that's maybe not so good. So the transfer from public wealth to private wealth that has happened throughout this period, so where you have a decline in public assets through privatization and an increase in public debt, this has contributed to the increase in private wealth. Look, Italy, they are at the top of private wealth and the bottom of public wealth. And of course, that's partly the explanation, is that the Italian households have bought a lot of the public debt issued by their own government and some of the assets privatized by their own government. So, there are more extreme cases than Italy. If I could draw the same curve for Russia, I will see that the share of public capital was 90%, during the Soviet period, and now it's close to zero, and the share of private capital has gone from 0 to 100%. And of course, the Russian oligarchs did not become rich by saving. They just this was a transfer from public to private wealth. Well, they paid the price, but it was a very low price, so it was like a transfer from public to private property. It's a very extreme example, and in some case, of course, it can be justified to privatize assets for efficiency reason, but the question is, how far do you go? And this has consequences, also when you have like in China, the privatization process will certainly continue, but as you have more and more private property, you need some other regulation system for private property, including taxation of private property, registration, transparency, taxation of inheritance. Otherwise, this creates a number of problems. So I will be very interested also, to see how this kind of evolution looks like in Taiwan. And I understand that there are some balance sheets that have been put together by national accounts in Taiwan, and I don't know. I suspect that the private wealth to GDP ratio has probably increased as well, given the evolution of real estate prices. But there are other effects going on, and I don't know. I have not seen the data, but I'd be very interested to see it. Let me now move to the evolution of inequality. So I talked a lot about R versus G in general, in pre-agrarian, pre-industrial societies where R was 5%, G 0%. Now I am jumping to the 21st century, so this is data coming from the Forbes rankings. So let me say, so this data indicates that the top wealth holders in the world seem to be rising a lot faster than average income, average wealth. Now, let me step back a little bit and make clear that I don't think this data is particularly reliable. And it is sad in a way that we have to read magazines, in order to learn about wealth. And I would much prefer if we could have, official statistical publication by National Statistical Institute or international organization like the IMF, where we could have data on how the structure of wealth and the different levels of wealth are changing in the world. The problem is that you will not find this data, partly because a number of Western governments and also the IMF during many years were opposed to international automatic transmission of information about cross-border financial assets, etc. So it's very difficult to produce, information if you don't have automatic transmission of information about who owns what in different countries and about cross-border financial assets. And so now everybody is saying that they are in favor of this and automatic transmission of information and transparency, but it's yet to be applied. And for the time being, we have to do with what we have. And I think the traditional household survey on wealth are very unreliable for the top of the distribution. The inheritance tax data or the asset tax information, like the one we have in Taiwan, can be more reliable than household survey, but it has also some imperfections. So, I think it's useful. In my book, I try to have a pragmatic approach to data sources. I use, very systematic national accounts and fiscal data when it exists, and sometimes I use, this kind of data when just to see what we can learn from it. So, what can we learn from this? So I start in 1987 because this is when the Forbes magazine started publishing their global ranking of billionaires. So usually what people do with this data is just to point out that you have more and more billionaires every year in the world, which is not very surprising because with a growing world economy, you have to have more and more billionaires. In itself, that's certainly not a problem. Now, here what I do is slightly more sophisticated in the sense that I take a fixed fraction of the world population. So the world population itself is growing. So you take a fixed fraction of the world population and you look at how the average wealth within this group is rising. And the answer is that it is rising at 6 to 7% per year, a lot faster than average income, average wealth in the world, which is, there's nothing obvious in this. Sometimes people say, well, it's because you have lots of new entrepreneurs, etc. Yeah, of course, you have lots of new entrepreneurs, but that's not an explanation in itself as to why the average wealth of this group should rise 3 times faster than the average. Because you have some people who go down, some people who go up, but in principle, these two effects should more or less compensate each other. So, you have mobility. Of course, the top people are not the same in 1987, 2013. So the top of the list in 1987 includes, a number of Japanese billionaires, which everybody has forgotten. And in 2013, you have billionaires from Mexico, China, India, the United States. So you have a lot of people go down. a lot of people go up. But if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, these two effects should more or less compensate each other, and the average wealth of this top group should rise approximately at the same speed as average wealth in the world and the size of the world economy. Whereas here, even if this data is not fully reliable, in every country where you have separate wealth rankings, you tend to find the same conclusion, that the top is rising 3-4 times faster than the average, which of course cannot continue forever. This cannot be an equilibrium situation. If you have that during another 30 or 40 or 50 years, this means the share of world wealth belonging to billionaire will go to 100%, which I think everybody would agree will be excessive. Even if you want entrepreneur, billionaire, it cannot be 100% of total wealth. So this has to stop somewhere, and this will stop somewhere. Now, where will it stop? I don't know, and I think nobody knows, and this is in itself a problem. The fact that this can go quite far. The share of wealth going to the top groups can increase at very high level, and so I think this is something, even if you believe in capitalism, entrepreneurship, etc., which I do very much, you need to have some balanced growth in the world. The different groups cannot grow at very different rates forever. You need to grow in line. You need rich people, poor people, middle people, but this needs to grow more or less in line with one another. This cannot be completely different for too long. What is the explanation for this very high rate of increase? It's a complicated issue, but I think part of it could be that so in the top groups, you have entrepreneurs, you have new oligarchs coming from Russia, the Middle East, people who own natural resources and were able during this period to access large quantity of natural resources. Maybe this is not going to continue forever. Maybe it's particular to this period. You also have maybe financial deregulation has probably contributed to increase the inequality in financial returns. So when you have, when we say R is bigger than G, we should remember that not everybody gets the same R. So, some people, if you have $100,000 and you go to your bank, or $10,000, you go to your bank, you're not going to get a huge rate of return. Whereas if you have millions or billions in financial assets, with financial deregulation, you are able to access financial products or financial derivatives that get higher rate of return. So just to give you an example of this, this is another piece of data that I use in the book, which are the returns to university endowments in the US. The reason I use this university data is because at least they provide data. They publish, universities publish what they do with their money. So we have financial statements, we know their portfolio allocation. So as you can see, they don't buy US treasury bonds. Okay, they would know, they buy very sophisticated financial products, complex derivatives, commodity derivatives, private equity, and they get very high returns. So over this period of time, there are 850 universities with capital endowments in the US. On average, they got a return of 8.2%. So it's a real return. You deduct inflation, you deduct all administrative costs, all management costs. So that's quite good. So, this could be because this was a period of time where you had particularly good return. Again, I'm not saying we'll have necessarily the same number again in the future, but, it's a useful guide to look at what happened in the previous decade. You can see that the higher you go, the higher your initial endowment, the higher your return. So take Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they get 10% per year over this period of time. This is an enormous increase over 20 or 30 years. When you grow, it's important to realize that when you grow at 7, 8, or 10% per year, when the average in the world grows at 1 or 2%, over just 30 or 40 years, this completely changes the distribution. So in the case, Harvard, Yale, or Princeton used to have endowments around $2 or $3 billion in 1990. Now they have 20, 30, 40. Okay, so this goes very fast, when you have 10% per year. It's important also to try to understand how they get this return. The total management cost for Harvard endowment right now are of the order of only 0.3% per year. So they spend only 0.3% of their endowment each year in management cost. But because they have 30, $40 billion in endowment, that's already 100 million. So if you can spend 100 million each year to pay a group of wealth managers, you can pay a good group of wealth managers, even if they are paid well individually. So if this allows you to get a return of 10 rather than 6, or even 6 rather than 4, this is worth it. Okay. Now, if you have 100 million as an endowment, you're not going to spend 100 million each year to take care of it. And if you have $100,000, you will ask your brother-in-law as to what you should do with your money, and that's not going to work. So these simple scale effects in portfolio management, can be quite powerful. And look, in the case of Harvard or US universities, maybe that's very good socially because they do useful things with the money. So I don't want, I'm not making a statement about US universities. I see, although this creates inequality between universities, which can be troublesome. But all I'm saying is that if this kind of logic of scale effect in portfolio management also applies to individuals at the world level, then this can be a bit troublesome. Let me also mention, to get closer to my conclusion and policy implications, that sometimes people, in the US in particular, but in other countries, believe that now billionaires have become so generous with their money that we don't really need taxation anymore, and private philanthropy is enough to pay for health, education, and everything, and that's the solution to every problem. I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration. I think private philanthropy is useful. I have contributed to the creation of the Paris School of Economics, which is a private foundation, and I did what it took to attract private donors and as well as public money. And I think private philanthropy can be very useful, but I think we should not be too naive as to how far this can go. And so let me take a very concrete example. In the case of Harvard, so they have a 10% financial return each year between 1980 and 2010. It's interesting to compare this with the total philanthropy and gifts that they have received over this period. And in annual level, the total gift by their former students and everybody else is less than 0.5% of their endowment each year. So, it's not entirely negligible. Sometimes it can be a useful way, to get your kid admitted to Harvard. So, you should never forget about such a possibility. But in terms of the total return to the endowment, this is really not very important. 10% financial return, 0.5% annual gift. This is publicly available information published by Harvard or other universities, so that's very easy to check. So, sometimes you have discourse about the generosity of billionaires, which is not completely in line with the data. And so I think it's important to put all these claims under public scrutiny and to look at the numbers and see what matters. And in this case, what really matters is much more the R bigger than G than the private philanthropy effect. So now I come to conclusions about policy. Let me just say that the most rational solution to inequality will be more transparency about income and wealth, so that we can adjust the tax rate that we ask to different income and wealth groups to whatever we observe. But of course, there are other solutions to redistribute wealth that are much less rational. We've seen that capital destructions during war played a big role. Inflation can be a powerful way to redistribute wealth. Other countries like in Russia and sometimes China, they use other ways. They let very wealthy oligarchs become very rich, and then suddenly they put an oligarch in jail when he tries to do politics. Which is another way to regulate inequality. And I'm not so sure it's very efficient, but so there are very different ways to, and different policies. Patent policy can be an important way also to regulate accumulation of property in a world where immaterial capital is becoming more and more important. So there are many different policies that are important. So I don't want to say progressive taxation of income and wealth is the only one, but this is certainly one of the important policies. Now the history of taxation is full of surprise. So we don't know what will happen in the future. So this is a brief history of top income tax rate in the US, UK, Germany, France, over the past century. So you can see that 1 century ago there was no income tax, or almost no income tax, and then suddenly, in particular in the US and the UK, top income tax rate rose to very, very high levels. So let me be very clear that this 80 or 90% top tax rate were only applied to very, very high levels, in the US and in the UK. In the US, it was like above $1 million in annual income. And this was applied during many decades. Apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism, probably because this only applied to very, very high incomes, typically above $1 million. And, there's little evidence that paying managers $10 million rather than one is so useful from an economic viewpoint. So, then under Reagan, the US went to the other extreme with the same enthusiasm which often characterizes this great country. And, each country has a very chaotic history with inequality and taxation, because this involves, representations, collective views about inequality, and this can change, for all sorts of reasons. In the future, so this is the evolution for top tax rate on income. In the future, you have the same kind of evolution for top tax rate on inheritance. It's a little bit less chaotic, because the inheritance tax is usually something that you don't change every year. You change it every 10 or 20 or 30 years, so it's less chaotic than the income tax, which every year we have a new debate. Goes in every direction, that's part of democracy. The inheritance tax is less chaotic, but still you have lots of variation. You can see that the US and the UK, just like for the income tax, are also the two countries that have invented steeply progressive taxation in the 20th century. So, it's important to be clear, progressive taxation was not invented in the Soviet Union. It was invented in the US and the UK, and these are the two countries that have used it a lot, because this is, in a way, this is a form of redistribution that's the most compatible with private property, free market, and rule of law economy. You let people use private property, the market system, and then you have a system that is predictable, where you say which tax rate you should pay. So anyway, this is the past history. I did not responsible for these facts. Whatever you think about this tax rate, this is history. Note that Germany and France had much lower rates of top estate tax, top inheritance tax than US and UK, partly because the capital destruction in France and Germany sort of did a lot of the wealth redistribution without the tax system, and so maybe probably the US and the UK also use the tax system more in Germany and France. It's interesting to see that the only time where Germany has a 60% tax rate, and you have the same, look for the income tax, the only time when Germany has a 90% tax rate is between 1946 and 1948, and this is when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans. Okay, and this is, and no, but I am serious. This was the Allied Control Council that was ruling Germany at that time, and so this was in effect the American, and the American picked a 90% tax rate for Germany, and then when the Bundesrepublik of Germany took back its sovereignty in 1950, they reduced it to much lower level. Because they thought that 90% was a crazy American idea, and that they should go back to 50%. And the same happened in Japan. The only years where you have a 90% tax rate in Japan is 1946 to 1948. And the Americans, it's important to remember that the Americans were not doing that to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same at home. So this was not a punishment. In their view, in the view of the time, that was part of the civilization package, if you want. You bring democratic institution, and at the same time you bring fiscal institution that will prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with extreme concentration of income and wealth. So I know that this can seem exotic to you and very, incredible, but this is part of our common history, and I think it's important to study the history of taxation and inequality, because these issues did not start last year. They've been with us for a long time. They will be with us forever. And I think, of course, in the future we may invent other solutions, and I do not pretend I can predict what's going to happen, of course. But in any case, I think it's useful to study this history in a comparative perspective in order to better face the challenges of the future. So let me stop there, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Piketty. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A section. Who want to start? Yes, please.
Professor Piketty, I'm a political scientist, so I'm very much interested in the implications of what you just said. Nowadays, people are obviously talking about the increasing income inequality under capitalism, and that's why I think your book is very popular. On the other hand, there were also people who would say that if you put too heavy tax on the on those who can actually generate wealth, then you would dampen growth. So would you accept that there's a trade-off between these two, namely competition and growth? On the other hand, tax and less income inequality. And so there will be, I mean, you have to balance between these two. So in the end, you are talking about probably increasing the tax rate in order to do something to ameliorate the income inequality. But then would that have a damaging impact on the growth front? How would you balance these two?
No, I fully agree. There's a trade-off. I have no. If you were to put 90% on everybody, I have no doubt that this will be a disaster. So the only reason why this kind of tax rate did not lead to a disaster, and it did not lead to a disaster. If you look at U.S. productivity growth between 1950 and 1980, it was higher than what it has been between 1980 and 2010. So clearly this did not harm productivity growth. This is because it's only applied to very, very high and extreme income levels, say above $1 million. And again, the evidence is that you don't need to pay managers so much. So if this had been applied to everybody above $100,000, probably this would have been very different. So it's all a matter of fine tuning. It's not. Inequality in itself can be useful for growth, and clearly, when China opens its economy, you have more inequality, but you have more growth, and that's much better than everybody equal in poverty. So you have no problem at all with inequality in itself. I am very much Rawlsian, if you want. As long as inequality is in the benefit of the poor, inequality, I have no problem with it. Now, I think above a certain level, inequality is not very useful. So we have to be very concrete, look at the historical experience, what works, what doesn't work. We have to, if you think of inheritance tax, this is evidence that you can have a 40% tax rate. All these countries have a 40% tax rate. Even though they are in a global economy, they are in an open economy. Now, it is true that with more international capital flows, this is getting more and more difficult for small countries to conduct their fiscal policy, and I can see why Taiwan or small countries in Europe are wondering how much can I have an inheritance tax on my own. I think that there's still more than we can do on our own at the national level than what we sometimes imagine. But of course, ideally we want to, if we want to regulate inequality in the global economy, we need more global cooperation. So, fighting against tax haven, having more financial transparency, that's absolutely necessary. And in this part of the world, in Asia, of course, it would be good if China was to move a little bit more in the direction of financial transparency and exchange of information, because otherwise, this is very difficult for countries that need to trade with China, to do on their own, the kind of fiscal system and transparency that we need. So, yes, there's some trade-off, and that's difficult. Does this mean that this is impossible to find the right balance? No, I think it's important. For the wealth tax, if the top groups are rising at 6 or 7% per year, it means that you can have a wealth tax. So let's be concrete. Right now, so you told me the property tax rate in Taiwan is about 0.1% for housing and 0% for financial assets. or yes, the level of you are taxed 0.1% on the value of your real estate property each year, and 0% on the value of your financial assets, your stock market. So, I'm not saying it should go to 100%, of course, but which could be confiscation. But I'm saying between 0.1%. If it was 1 or 2% on these groups of people, if they are rising at 6-7% per year, I think it would not be reasonable to say that this is too much. If they are indeed rising at 6-7% per year. But maybe they are not rising at 6-7% per year. I think my most important conclusion is that we need more transparency in order to better know how the different groups of income and wealth are doing. And then we can adapt the fine-tuning of the trade-off you're describing to whatever we observe.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about your sort of underlying conceptualization of the shifts that you're tracking here, where you have sort of very high levels of inequality in the 19th century. They fall very rapidly, especially after the Depression and the war, and then they sort of maintain constant, relatively lower levels in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then rise very rapidly afterwards. So it sounds to me like the explanation that you're developing here is that these sort of contingent events come together to reduce inequality, and then a sort of underlying like natural feature of capitalism reasserts itself and causes inequality to rise again. So I wanted to ask you about a contrasting approach like that of the regulation school, which would look at the whole system, the economic system, the sort of the labor regime, the political system, and even into something like cultural patterns as a coherent whole that's underwriting a particular form of accumulation. So in the earlier period, accumulation relies upon high levels of inequality and reproduces them. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, accumulation, and we should remember that the rates of growth were actually higher in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when inequality was higher around the world. And tax rates were higher and government intervention was more robust. But that this was sort of part of an all-around system that reproduced high rates of growth and rising rates of equality.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and really this is exactly what I try to do in my book. I try to show that this is an entire set of institutions that deliver, different inequality regimes. So, it's not only, contingent events, well, maybe first the wars are not so contingent, maybe the wars themselves are induced by the social tension, and I think the rise of nationalism in World War I Europe, had a lot to do with the huge inequality, social tension of the time. So I think the wars themselves may not be, completely contingent event. And in any case, even taking these events as are given, the institutional responses to these events were, even more important than the events themselves. So what really matters, for the different inequality regimes that we have is the set of fiscal institution, welfare state, educational institution, financial regulation. So I try in my book as much as I can to tell this complex institutional story, and this is really what I have in mind. But political shocks and political events are also important in this story. What would have happened to progressive taxation and welfare state between 1914? It's I think the discourse about inequality are also they are shaped by events and which then shape institutions, which then contribute to shape the new belief system and perceptions about the economy and inequality. So there's really a two-way interaction between the three-way interaction between institution, belief system, and the evolution of the economy. So I try to to show that, in particular, the study of representations of inequality is an integral part of the study of inequality. And one reason why I look at the representations of inequality in the literature in the 19th century or in political discourse in France in the interwar or pre-World War period or today is because these representations of inequality are very important to induce changes in institutions. So, no, I think I am very close in a way to this regulation school you are describing. In fact, Robert Boyer was next to me in my corridor during 15 years, and so I know him, I know that very well. So it's in a way it belongs to the same approach. It's just I don't like too much to put names on schools because I think sometimes we lose a lot of time just between conflict between different schools. So I prefer to take the issue of inequality and to me the boundaries between economics and history and sociology are not very clear. So the boundaries within economics, are even less clear, and I prefer not to spend too much time talking about these boundaries and try to make progress with the issues.
In your discussion, you have not really talked at all about the issue of consumption, also the limit of a environmental related issues, and also the limitation of natural resources. If those things are factored in, will that change some of your conclusion or?
Right. So I actually conclude in the last chapter of the book with the issue of natural capital, and of course the main risk that we are facing right now is that maybe you have this increase in private monetary capital, but maybe you have a decline in natural capital at the same time, and in the long run that can be much more important. It's I think one of the main problems we have right now is that we spend a lot of time trying to deal with our little public debt problem, but the public debt is just a debt to ourselves. We can change it very easily, and we have already in the past in Europe in particular reduced public debt much bigger than that by just destroying it, and inflation, it's just a matter, it's a debt to ourselves. Whereas when we have 2 additional degrees on the planet, of course, you cannot do anything just like this by changing it in a book. So, if we are not able, what I conclude in the last chapter of the book is that if we are not able to solve our financial regulation and inequality problem, how are we going to do with the bigger problems that have to do with our natural capital or environment? So, I don't talk more than that about in the book because, as a scholar, I don't have much to contribute to this, but certainly, as a citizen, I fully agree with you that this is probably the most pressing issue. In the capital accounts I use in the book, the only forms of capital that are taken into account are those that are already monetized on the market. So the only natural resources that are taken into account are those that have already been discovered and exploited. And so by definition, this is not a proper account to study the depletion of natural resources. But this should be done. And some people, of course, study this and maybe I should have referred more explicitly to more research in this area and more than in the last chapter of the book.
Yeah, actually, my question is similar. If next year, at the end of next year, in Paris, COP21, if everybody comes on agreement about deep decarbonization and bring the emission down to 3 tons or 2 tons per capita, then because technology will not be moving fast enough to replace all the fossil energy. So on the way, it looks is to reduce the economy or consumption. Energy certainly will be reduced, and also because of the climate change, food production will go down. So the next half century, economy probably will move in a very different direction if we were to be able to survive on Earth. So I'm wondering what would exaggerate this program of income in distribution.
Yeah, I think the two issues of inequality and our natural capital, depletion of natural resources are very much related in different ways. First of all, of course, the growth rate, plays an important role in the dynamics of inequalities that I have here. So, one reason why growth in the future might be much lower than what it has been is the fact that for environmental reason it cannot continue forever. So maybe we can find new technologies to have renewable energy sources, but maybe not. And with the current technology available, of course, we cannot keep growing at this speed for very long. And it's important to realize that a big part of the historical growth in the world has been population. And so if you take the total growth rate of GDP over the past 3 centuries, this is estimated to be around 1.6% per year at the world level. Now, exactly half of it comes from population, 0.8% per year, and half of it for per capita GDP. So this can seem very small, but in fact, of course, if you cumulate this over a long period of time, this was enough to multiply by 10 the world population from 600 million to 7 billion today, from the 18th century to today. So, are we going to be 70 billion 3 centuries from now? Probably not. So this will have to go to zero, and this is already going to zero. Although negative population growth, I should say, is a bit frightening to me and has implications in particular for inequality and the importance of inheritance in society that are a bit frightening. So if we can keep having zero or slightly positive population growth, I think that would be a bit better. And for productivity growth, in principle, this could continue forever if we had clean and renewable energy sources, but which we don't have them for now. So yes, that's that. Yeah.
So most of the scientists working on the climate change and sustainable development would all agree that unless we establish equitable society, probably we will not reach there. What you are saying?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with this. I think it's very difficult to ask normal people or middle class or poor people to make efforts and changes in their lifestyle and to pay more carbon tax or to change entirely their lifestyle if you don't guarantee that to them that this is the entire society that's changing in the right direction. And if people feel that they are paying more and more carbon tax, this is a debate that we've had for instance in France these past few years. It was very difficult to introduce a carbon tax because I think at the same time because the tax is hurting proportionally to their income the poor and the middle class more than the rich. Many people were asking for compensation in terms of higher tax progressivity on the rich through the income or the wealth tax, and because this was not being done, at the end of the day, the carbon tax was rejected. So I think, you need, to fight inequality and, environmental damage at the same time, and that's a difficult part.
Sorry to take the last question. Thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting. What I found very interesting in it is the way you're kind of critical about economics as a discipline, and you're critical in it in quite a charming way, I think. But what I'd like to ask is, what does that mean for how we study the economy, and what the role of other social scientific disciplines are in that for that study, and how we should organize academia accordingly? What are your ideas about that?
You know, I think we in economics we spend too much time, you know, teaching complicated mathematical models and too little time teaching about economic history and more, you know, empirical issues. And you know, you can do an entire career in economics without knowing anything about economics. You know, just by proving theorems. And economists sometimes feel that this is a way to look scientific and to impress other disciplines, but of course they don't impress mathematicians or physicists, you know, with the math that they are doing. So I think it's hopeless. You know, if they want to do math, they should do math, which is a very interesting subject in itself. But if they want to do economics, I think, you know, math is useful, but you know, it has to be, I think, simple in the social sciences. And you know, maybe 50 years or 100 years from now, we will be able to use complicated math in a productive way in the social sciences. But for now, you know, I think the facts that we have to establish and the mechanism we have to study to understand them, you know, are relatively simple. And so we should move our curriculum in this direction. You know, I think at the same time, you know, it's important that other social sciences, you know, don't let the study of economic issues to economists. And you know, what I'm trying, as you said in your introduction, you know, there used to be a school in history, in particular in France, École des Annales, you know, looking at economic and social history, looking at the history of wages, prices, and a lot of very good research by, you know, Brodel, Labrousse, Simian, looking at wages in the 19th century. And this has almost disappeared because most of history has become more centered on cultural issues, political issues, which of course are very important, but I think it's important to, you know, not to let economic issues to economists. So everybody has a responsibility, you know, in the sharp boundaries that have developed between discipline. And I think to study, you know, even cultural issues and you know, representations of the economy, you need to study together, you know, the history of wages, prices, income, because this is also the institutional setup in which culture develops and belief system develop. And so it's, you know, you know, I hope this book can contribute a little bit to that, and certainly, you know, I would like, you know, more sociologists and historians also to take these issues more you know, intensively than they sometimes do. Yeah, you know, I view this work as at least as much as a work in history as a work in economics, and again, I don't believe too much in the boundaries, in these very rigid boundaries. So I don't know the curriculum in Taiwan, but in France, for instance, you know, we have, you know, you can enter university in year one and do almost only economics for your first 3 years, and I think this is nonsense. But probably you don't do that here. I don't know, but in France, I know this is too extreme. You know, you don't want to get people specialized so soon. You know, in economics, you know, there's not enough to teach for 3 full years in economics. You know, I think you need to do much more sort of interdisciplinary things as long as possible.
Time's up. I'm a historian, so I like Professor Piketty's speech very much. His speech reminds me 2 things. One is that the founder of Annals School, 年鉴学派, Braudel, Fernand Braudel, I think you are very familiar with that. Yeah. He mentioned that one of the approaches to study history is longue durée. That's to see to see history in a very long range way. So like Professor Piketty take the tax and price history in 200 years. And the second point is that in Chinese all saying that 以古鉴今, taking history as a mirror and looking forward to the future. I think you just did a very splendid speech, and thank you very much.